on your own.
Hello.
Charlotte will be there. And
Oh, will she actually sit in with me?
well, no, but like she'll introduce you. So let's say that's a friendly, welcoming voice.
No, I thought she was. So she introduces me as in she'll actually be in the room introducing me.
No.
Or she'll be on screen.
Yeah, she'll be on the screen.
Yeah.
Mrs. Lancaster's nice, isn't she? Mrs. Lancaster.
Yeah, she used to be head of middle school.
Oh, did she?
So before Pete.
Colour, please.
She's a fierce lady, isn't she?
Oh yeah.
Wouldn't mess with her.
No.
Just do me one and then
She's also just smiling and jolly and chilled now, isn't she? Whereas, you know, I remember her when the kids were terrified of her.
Oh, she was fierce as fierce.
Really?
Oh yeah.
She was.
Nobody messed with that lady.
A Rottweiler of a middle school, head of middle school. She's very good.
Yeah, the kids were terrified of her, weren't they?
Yeah.
You want?
Yeah. You do with middle school, don't you? Because that's when the scrote bags start.
But what are we saying about Pete? Because we all know Pete's a teddy bear.
He's not. But
He's
that's
not
balanced out.
He's not a Ruth, is he?
No, Bedman.
Helen. Helen's a bit of a
Helen.
Rottweiler.
Yeah, Helen can be scary, can't she?
Scares me. She's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, Pete's a bit of a teddy bear.
Thank you. What your glasses?
I was surprised. It sounds horrible.
Thank you.
I'm surprised he got it because I just think he's too nice.
But then if he's got Helen, but yeah, because Ruth used to be really scary, didn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ruth was really scary.
Oh, that's not working.
The talk's going to have to be cancelled.
The camera's
Technical difficulties.
Do you need me, Paul, for the next few minutes, or can I sneakily grab a water? Run out of water.
It's just not working anyway. So.
Oh dear. Oh, I think it's
do it from school. So
So-
15, I'd have 15 kids in front of me, and sometimes there'd be kids at home as well. Or I was just teaching in the bubble, which is grim. How many children come in here?
Yeah, that's not working.
It is or it's not.
It is. So it's working. So there she. She can share her screen. Bring up anything.
Fabulous.
Right, yeah. So
Thank
it's
you,
just on the
Paul.
share button. So she needs to obviously run whatever document she wants to run in the background. She's on a half battery, so she probably could do it plugging it in.
Yeah, I think she's going to go into my room. So yeah, so she can just plug it in. It's brilliant.
Well,
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your help. That was very good of you.
okay.
Thank you.
Bye, Paul.
It's not happy. He's saying 10 minutes over. Right.
Muscle. No, honestly, you just watch. You just. Oh
Bit
dear.
of a state over here.
You what?
So a bit of a state. Hit a wall.
2 more weeks. Not even 2 more weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of miles.
He says the camera's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
He said to be mindful of the battery. You haven't got very much battery.
Oh, I've got my charger with me. He said, you know. I've seen Sean and she's still coming up with the. Oh, wait.
There you go.
Dr. Eagleton, I'm going to put a couple of slides up first just to introduce the Oxbridge network and give some key dates, and then I'll pass over to you if that's all right. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see you and I can hear you, and I can see the wonderful Thomas Hardy portrait in the front there. Do you mind if I move my slide onto this?
No, not at all.
So if I share my screen, and then I'll just put that off, and then I'll stop sharing and you can actually get on with it. Now, the issue is this going to come up? Hang on a minute. There you go. Right, now can you see that?
Yes.
Right, so I need to get it onto slideshow. Right, there you go. So can you see it? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good, great. So we'll wait until it's actually 5 o'clock and then we'll get started. There are some people in the waiting room. So the one thing I've done, Dr. Eagleton, as well, is I've actually disabled the chat so that we don't have, independent chats going on. But there is a Q&A thing. So we'll ask the students to actually ask questions on the Q&A, unless, of course, you want them to talk to you. But I think I've disabled that as well, actually. Okay. And this will record as well. So I'm assuming that's going to be okay. So we're going to, I'll talk to you about what we do about that afterwards. It's 16:57. I'm going to close the door because there seems to be a lot of noise outside. If you can hang on a minute. I've had quite a few inquiries about today as well. So quite a few of the schools have actually said that they're encouraging their students to come to this. So hopefully you'll get some decent interaction as well with questions afterwards. I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. So we've got 3 minutes. Okay.
I do like your background, Dr. Foster.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I am going to have to. I've got another one as well, actually, which is I don't know if you've come across the one which is a baker and his wife, and she's got a stylus, and they're two freed people, but it demonstrates that free people could actually write in the ancient world, and it's quite an iconic one as well, actually. But I thought I'd have Ajax and Achilles actually playing dice tonight. Right, now then, if you can hang on a minute, I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. I wouldn't want to start before it's 5 o'clock because some people might be tuning in on time. Right, we've got 1 minute. This will only take about 2 minutes, actually, if that. And then once I've done that, then I'll hand over to you, Dr. Eagleton. Okay. Yeah, really looking forward to this. Once it clicks into 1700, we'll do it. Okay. The anticipation's killing me. I'm just very grateful to you, Dr. Eagleton.
I know. Thank you for asking me to speak.
Right, it's clicked in and it's 1700. Welcome to everybody who's joined us. We cannot see how many of you have joined us at the moment, but welcome. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Oxbridge network, and then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Amy Eagleton, who's actually going to be talking about love, lost and longing in the works of Thomas Hardy, and we're all waiting in anticipation for that. So I'm just going to move into what the Oxbridge network is. It's the Solihull, Coventry and Birmingham Oxbridge network, and schools are joining it as we speak, really. There are 11 schools, possibly 12 now, actually, in the network. And it really is about providing experience to everybody who's actually a part of each of these schools, and sharing experience and giving tips, hints and help in terms of preparation for Oxbridge applications. And it's also a chance for students to mix and to meet with each other, and also see what the competition looks like in the other schools. What can we offer? The Oxbridge application admissions talk was last week. It was actually online. We will be doing some more actually, and we do tend to do those face to face. We're doing the Oxbridge Network lecture series, and there will be another lecture towards Christmas, which will be on a different topic, and I will send that through to your coordinators. There is an interview talk with Cambridge admissions staff in person. They'll be covering Oxford and Cambridge on the 7th of November, and it's actually at Solihull School. And so everybody from all the network schools will be welcome to come, and you can ask questions from the horse's mouth, really. You can actually hear the answers from the Cambridge admissions tutors. It's your opportunity, especially if you're in the upper sixth, but if you're in the lower sixth, you're welcome to come, and anybody else who has an interest in applying to Oxford or Cambridge. The interview exchange that we run is only for the upper sixth, and that's on the 9th of November in Solihull School. And what that does is it gives everybody an opportunity to be interviewed by a complete stranger, so that when you get to interview at Oxford or Cambridge, it doesn't feel as if you're rabbits in the headlights. If you want to know what it's really like at Oxford or Cambridge, then there is a student experience online talk, and the date is there. And then advance warning for next term, we will be running a tutorial event, which mirrors the types of tutorials or supervisions at Oxford and Cambridge. The network essay prize will be launched again for the 3rd year in December, and there are prizes of cash for doing that. The deadline is half term May in the summer. And there are a variety of other things that we will be planning, but there is a trip to Girton College, Cambridge, which the network runs for all schools in March or April, and I have got a date for that, which is in March. So there are lots of things to take advantage of, and a lot of things on offer for you to gain experience in preparation for interviews. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Eagleton now, who's actually going to provide us with our talk this evening. And we are really, really grateful to her. It all sounds absolutely fascinating. Please ask your questions in the Q&A section, and please send them through. You can send them through as we talk, as Dr. Eagleton talks, and she will deal with the questions at the end. Is that okay, Dr. Eagleton?
Yes, yeah, sounds good.
Great. I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Eagleton. I'm going to get out of this and stop sharing my screen. And we'll just get to the technical bits of this, just make sure that the thing is actually working. And I'm going to stop sharing. Over to you.
Okay. Right, just to check, Dr. Foster, is it sharing okay?
No, I can't see anything at the moment. I can see
Right,
you, but I
probably
can't
need
see
to
the
reshare.
screen.
Okay, bear with me, everybody. I'm just going to reshare my screen. Here we go. Right. Screen.
Yes, we can see it. That's
There we
absolutely
go.
fine. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully it's gone bigger now as well. Has it filled the
Yes.
screen?
Yeah, I'm going
Great.
to switch my camera off now. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Foster. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about love, loss and longing in the works of Thomas Hardy, who you can see on the screen. So I first came across Thomas Hardy at a similar age to probably the age most of you are at, when I was studying for my A-levels. And it was his poetry that I first came across and really fell in love with his work. And I'd say he's one of my literary heroes. So I'm just going to start by talking to you about why I think he's such a powerful writer, and then move into a bit of his background, and then we'll be taking a look at some key passages from the Mayor of Casterbridge, and then move into a couple of his poems towards the end of the lecture. So as my title, Love, Loss and Longing, might suggest, Hardy as a writer was very concerned with and incredibly honest about the emotional life of human beings. He looks a very serious man in this very Victorian photograph of him that you can see. But as a writer, he didn't gloss over the uncomfortable or difficult feelings that characterise the human condition. And his works expose deeply intimate conflicts and fractures within relationships. So relationships with others, relationships with the wider world. And I think most profoundly within his writing, he really does start to explore tensions within relationships with oneself, relationships within one's own identity too. And we're going to see a little bit of that today as we look at his poetry. His writing explores regret, regret for things that one has said or done, or perhaps most movingly, I think, and honestly, things that weren't said and that we wish were said. Grief and yearning, he explores grief and yearning for what has been lost, and that's including loss of faith. We'll touch upon the context of that a little bit today. Loss of youth, loss of love or loved ones, and also loss of bygone traditions and ways of life. He was a writer who really felt sentimental about ways of life that were starting to change and disappear within the period in which he lived. So we're going to touch upon that as well. And as a writer, I think he writes with a really raw and unashamed sentimentality and a really touchingly simplistic expression, which gives a real power to his messages. So underpinning and heightening these emotions in Hardy's poetry and his prose is the simple and painful recognition that so often life could easily have turned out so differently. And that's a recurring theme really within his writing. Things could so easily have been so different. He was often keenly and bitterly aware of how profoundly the paths of individual lives could be shaped by an instance of poor timing. So how one impulsive action or decision or a simple coincidence could change the course of a life forever. And that again is really a recurring theme both within his novels and within his own poetry. The experiences of love, loss and longing that recur throughout his writing were all too often to the mind of this reluctantly agnostic writer, and we will touch upon that a little bit. So the Victorian period, obviously great changes in terms of religious faith and events occurring that started to shatter the faith of people at the time. So he did become an agnostic and spoke openly about that. And to him, very often in his writing, he spoke of how things as he saw it were very often the result of chance and time's passage, and there's that loss of a sense of a divine plan that we often see echoing throughout his work too. So a little bit about his background. So he was there we go, moving on to the next slide hopefully. So he was born in 1840 and died in 1928, so an incredible span of time witnessed by Hardy throughout his life. And it was a time of great social, political and religious change. So if you think about it, he was born in 1840 in the reign of Queen Victoria. He was alive in the Edwardian period, so we saw the death of Queen Victoria, the succession of Edward to the throne, and then also saw the reign of King George, moving into sort of the period of the First World War, which he also witnessed. So on screen, just a sense of, and just a few really, of the very significant events and changes that would have taken place within his lifetime. So at the very bottom of the screen, the Industrial Revolution, it had started before Hardy's birth, but it was really gathering momentum. He was seeing the landscape being affected by urbanisation, the disruption of local ways of life, the movement of communities away from the countryside. He saw the publication of The Origin of Species. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but he was 19 when Darwin publicised those theories about natural evolution. And then, of course, saw the devastation of the First World War. So he's been referred to as the time-torn man by Claire Tomalin, somebody who responded with difficulty and saw a conflict in the passage of time, the loss of time. And I think it's easy to understand why when we consider some of the momentous events that he witnessed within that very long span through a number of reigns and great social changes. Very idyllic image on the screen. So Hardy was born in this cottage in 1840. So moving into a bit of a background of him first to just give us a framework for his writing. So he was born in this cottage in 1840. It was built by his grandfather. And if you're lucky enough to go and visit it, it's in Dorchester, in Dorset. On the outskirts. It's a National Trust property, so you can go and visit. I would highly recommend it. But the fact that he was born into a cottage built by his own grandfather, I think really says something about the close family ties of the period that he was born into and the rural traditions that he would have grown up within. He attended the church in which his grandparents had played in the orchestra and sang in the choir. So it was very much an embedded way of life, really tight communities. And of course, many of these things were going to start to change over the course of Hardy's life. But as idyllic as it does all look, with that beautiful cottage there, he entered the world in quite a dramatic way, actually. So he was conceived outside of marriage, and his parents were forced to marry rather reluctantly because of the shame and stigma of having a child outside of marriage. So they married several months before Hardy was born, and there was that resentment. His mother was quite an independent woman. So far from being born into what looks like a really idyllic childhood home, he actually probably was witness growing up to an element of strain, and we see that sort of that Victorian pressure to uphold that moral reputation. So having married parents, which might have led to some resentment within the family home. He was locally educated, and not privileged to attend university. So again, we're talking about a period where not all families would have the wealth to be able to send their children into higher education. And that is something that Hardy picks up upon in Jude the Obscure, through the character of Jude, if anybody goes on to read that novel. So he began working life at 16, not able to go to university, but he did have literary ambitions even as a young man. And he began life as an architect's apprentice. And in his novels as well, you will start to notice, if you keep that in mind, you'll start to observe detailed little references here and there to masonry and church architecture, the observations of his expert eye, having trained as an architect and particularly specialising in church architecture too. He then embarked upon tried to embark upon a literary career. He wasn't successful at first. Like many great writers, he was initially rejected. He started off his literary ambitions trying to be a poet, but unfortunately was rejected and also had his first novel turned down. But however, there is a real positive and a sort of a message of resilience here. By the age of 33, he'd published 3 novels and had become a full-time novelist. He had married the woman that he'd fallen in love with in Cornwall on a work commission. He went down there as an architect to do some work, and he was able to build a family home for them, and you can see that on screen. Also a National Trust property, and one that you can still visit today, Maxgate. And it was very close to his old family home. So despite his literary success and rise to fame, we can still see elements of that sentimentality, those close family ties and those ties to Dorset, which was very beloved to him. So to give you a sense of Hardy's success as a writer, and you might have come across some of these texts already, I've just given you a couple of images on screen of the different versions you can buy today of Hardy's work. And the Mayor of Casterbridge we are going to be focusing in on. So by 33, he'd published 3 novels. However, he went on to publish a further 11 novels, so really well regarded as a writer. And he was in his own lifetime considered a great literary figure and a poet as well, really importantly, I think, to him, because of course he had wanted to start out as a poet. And you can see in the bottom right hand corner a cover there with his own handwriting on, number of his poems on the front there. So coming to the end of his life, so Hardy died in 1928. So as I say, he'd lived through an incredible amount of social, religious and political change. And his ashes were buried, and I find this really interesting. So his ashes were buried at Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner. So he really was considered a poet, a writer of the nation, and they wanted to claim him and recognise him, as we do with our great writers, by burying him at Westminster Abbey. However, by Hardy's own request, his heart remained buried in Dorset. And you can see on the screen, this is his childhood church in Stinsford. You can still go and visit his grave. I did that a couple of years ago. So that was where he wanted his heart to remain. And I think for us, again, it gives us a real sense of the landscape that he loved so much, the fact that he wanted his heart to be buried there. He had an ongoing connection to the landscape and community of his past. We see it in his writing, but we also see it in that decision to, despite his fame and rise to being a public figure, he saw that the heart of him still belonged in his beloved Dorset. Okay, so moving on then to Hardy's writing itself. So we're going to have a look first of all at some key passages from one of his most celebrated novels, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and look at how Hardy really gets beneath the skin of his characters to consider ideas and feelings about love, loss and longing. So here we go. The Mayor of Casterbridge. So The Mayor of Casterbridge, it was published in 1886. And the subtitle is The Life and Death of a Man of Character. So we know really the eponymous character, the mayor, he is going to die over the course of the narrative. So I'm not giving away any spoilers there. It does tell you in the subtitle. So it follows the rise and fall of our protagonist, Michael Henchard, the mayor, over a period of 23 years. And we're going to start by having a look at the very opening passage from the novel. So we have one evening of late summer before the 19th century had reached 1/3 of its span, a young man and woman, the latter carrying a child, were approaching the large village of Weydon Priors in Upper Wessex on foot. They were plainly but not ill-clad, though the thick hoar of dust which had accumulated on their shoes and garments from an obviously long journey lent a disadvantageous shabbiness to their appearance just now. The man was a fine figure, swarthy and stern in aspect, and he showed in profile a facial angle so slightly inclined as to be almost perpendicular. He wore a short jacket of brown corduroy, nearer than the remainder of his suit, which was a fustian waistcoat with white horn buttons, breeches of the same, tanned leggings, and a straw hat overlaid with black glazed canvas. At his back he carried by a looped strap a rush basket, from which protruded at one end the crutch of a hay knife, a wimble for hay bonds being also visible in the aperture. His measured, springless walk was the walk of the skilled countryman, as distinct from the desultory shamble of the general labourer, while in the turn and plant of each foot there was further a dogged and cynical indifference personal to himself, showing its presence even in the regularly interchanging fustian folds, now in the left leg, now in the right, as he paced along. So the very opening passage there from the Mayor of Casterbridge, and we're going to take a closer look at how he opens that novel. So the passage begins on what I'd say is a very nostalgic note, establishing the beginning of the action over 50 years before Hardy's current time of writing the novel. And I think this distance in time lends the couple's fateful journey, the couple that we're seeing walking, an almost mythical air, but it also paves the way for Hardy to lament the disappearance of a bygone time. As the narrative time span throughout the novel progresses, we start to hurtle closer to his current age. So by setting the novel at a significantly earlier time, he opens up the way to be able to romanticise about the past, and throughout the novel we do see a backdrop of change and regret about how the countryside is starting to change. So the setting is Wessex, and you can see a map of Wessex there below, which Hardy himself described as a partly real, partly dream country. So he used the term Wessex in a number of his novels. And the name is actually a historic name. So Hardy took the name Wessex from the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. One of the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England was called Wessex, and it was based in the southwest. So it's a fictional landscape, but also it's got historic resonance. And it aligns very closely to the real landscape of Hardy's own southwest England. So people have actually taken the time to create a map, as you can see on screen, of Hardy's Wessex, and they've identified places that you'll recognise today. We've got the Isle of Wight, we've got Lyme Regis on there. So they've been able to actually chart by looking at Hardy's novels how his partially imaginary Wessex actually maps onto the real southwest of England. But Hardy, always sort of the romantic, clinging to a bygone age, has used an archaic term, Wessex, there. His initial sentence gives us an apparently romantic tableau. So at first appearance, we appear to have a rural family together on a late summer evening. And we might have something a bit like the image on the screen in mind, a pastoral ideal, an image there of innocent love. However, he very quickly within his opening sentences starts to inject a sense of strain within that relationship. So that even that reference to late summer, which initially appears romantic, if we dig a little bit deeper, late summer provides imagery of seasonal transition. So we might wonder, is this actually signalling a more negative moment within the relationship, a movement into the autumn of the marriage that we're seeing in this opening paragraph? And this impression of marital love is cleverly inverted too by the references to their long journey. So as we read on, it becomes less and less romantic. They've had a long journey, and we have a thick hoar of dust accumulating on their clothing. I think both of those things are symbols of their stagnating, increasingly uncomfortable marriage. And he refers to their disadvantageous shabbiness. So any sense of idealisation is shattered by this realistic, unglamorous detail of a grueling rural journey as we dig a bit deeper into this initial opening passage. As Hardy's narrative lens moves away from the family tableau to focus on the individual character of Henchard himself, the trajectory of his tragedy is set up through visual details that signal the flaws that will come to haunt him and lead to his great losses within the novel. So as we saw within that opening passage, his very manner of holding himself and moving, even down to the beautiful detail in which Hardy captures his gait and the fabric creases on his legs, speaks of the strong-willed nature of this character, his capacity for arrogance and rebellion, which will mark his future and bring about his downfall. He's a man, we learn in this passage, of cynical indifference and stubbornness, and we can already sense that downfall to come. Interestingly, this is a technique that Hardy uses in Far from the Maddening Crowd, which was an earlier novel, one that you might have heard of, and also in a novel to come after The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So I'm just going to read out these little extracts, and hopefully you'll notice a similarity. So Far from the Maddening Crowd, very near to the opening of the novel, it's about a page in. We have, but some thoughtful persons who had seen him walking across one of his fields on a certain December morning, sunny and exceptionally mild, might have regarded Gabriel Oak in other aspects than these. In his face, one might notice that many of the hues and curves of youth had tarried on to manhood. There even remained in his remoter crannies some relics of the boy. His height and breadth would have been sufficient to make his presence imposing had they been exhibited with due consideration. But there is a way some men have, rural and urban alike, for which the mind is more responsible than flesh or sinew, a way of curtailing their dimensions by their manner of showing them. And this is the bit we're really interested in. And from a quiet modesty that would have become a vestal, which seemed continually to impress upon him that he had no great claim on the world's room, Oak walked unassumingly and with a faintly perceptible bend, quite distinct from a bowing of the shoulders. So Hardy, once again, using this very minute physical detail of the way in which a character walks across a rural setting, to establish and set up character traits that we're going to see throughout the novel. So in this case, we see Gabriel Oak's humility and self-deprecation in his manner of walking and bearing himself. And it's these traits which arguably keep him from attracting the love of Bathsheba Everdeen, the heroine of the novel, until much loss has occurred. I don't want to put any spoilers in, but there are going to be some tragedies that result from Bathsheba not being drawn to Oak initially as a suitor. Then we've got the later Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Again, opening page of the novel. On an evening in the latter part of May, a middle-aged man was walking homeward from Shaston to the village of Marlott in the adjoining Vale of Blakemore. The pair of legs that carried him were rickety, and there was a bias in his gait which inclined him somewhat to the left of a straight line. So Hardy here drawing upon this very symbolic physical detail of the manner of a character's walk and bearing. And here in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, this does foreshadow, I would argue, John Durbeyfield's gullibility and less than upstanding morality. So this idea of he somewhat inclines to the left of a straight line. I read that as symbolically, this isn't a character who has completely strict morals. It's not somebody who's particularly upstanding. He's somewhat, veering from a straight path in life. There we go. So interesting similarities there between the Mayor of Casterbridge and a number of Hardy's other literary works. You can see him using the same sort of literary tools to craft his characters at the opening of his novels. Back to the Mayor of Casterbridge. So in the paragraph that follows that initial one, where we see the couple walking together and we start to sense the fractures within their relationship, Hardy then gives us a really psychologically complex picture of marital unhappiness and neglect. He delves beneath the initial image of unity, exposing the true isolated state of the lovers. So I'm just going to give this one a reading out, and I have highlighted key bits that we're going to think about in blue. So we have, what was really peculiar, however, in this couple's progress and would have attracted the attention of any casual observer otherwise disposed to overlook them, was the perfect silence they preserved. They walked side by side in such a way as to suggest afar off the low, easy, confidential chat of people full of reciprocity. But on closer view, it could be discerned that the man was reading or pretending to read a ballad sheet, which he kept before his eyes with some difficulty by the hand that was passed through the basket strap. Whether this apparent cause were the real cause, or whether it were assumed one to escape an intercourse that would have been irksome to him, nobody but himself could have said precisely. But his taciturnity was unbroken, and the woman enjoyed no society whatever from his presence. Virtually, she walked the highway alone, save for the child she bore. Sometimes the man's bent elbow almost touched her shoulder, for she kept as close to his side as was possible without actual contact. But she seemed to have no idea of taking his arm, nor he of offering it, and far from exhibiting surprise at his ignoring silence, she appeared to receive it as a natural thing. If any word at all were uttered by the little group, it was an occasional whisper of the woman to the child, a tiny girl in short clothes and blue boots of knitted yarn, and the murmured babble of the child in reply. Okay, so we now have digging beneath this image of initially what we may have thought of as a unified couple. We have isolation between them. And I think here in this passage, we can really see Hardy's perceptiveness about relationships and in particular about lost love. He captures a really telling silence within the marriage, the perfect silence they preserve. We've got there his ignoring silence later on within the passage. And it's a silence that's become so habitual that it's received, Hardy writes, as a natural thing by the young Mrs. Henchard. Her efforts to remain physically close, so, almost touching his shoulder, but not quite as close as she can get without actual contact to him. I think it really heightens the emotional distance within their marriage. It's almost painful how closely she's walking to him and yet being careful not to touch him, and really indicates, I think, her longing for love, affection and security. So there's a lot of really physical symbolism happening here. And her desire for this security and companionship finds an outlet instead in her maternal relationship with her child, with whom, really tellingly, she has her only tender interactions within the passage. And the child's babbles, the murmured babble of the child in reply, her occasional whispering to the child, juxtaposed with the silence of the parents, the husband and wife, I think the child's responses only serve to magnify the fractures within the couple's own relationship. There's even a little bit of painful humour, characteristic of Hardy, added by our omniscient narrator's speculation, as he, contemplates, is Mr. Henchard pretending to read, perhaps, to escape an intercourse that would have been irksome to him? So, is he even reading the ballad sheet in an attempt to not have to engage with his wife because it's becoming a little bit irritating for him. So a little bit of realism, and I'm calling it painful humour. We've all sort of seen situations like that, I think, where people use different methods to try and avoid having to actually talk to somebody that they don't quite like or want to avoid. And it's all, of course, in this passage underscored by the irony that a casual, more distant observer, as he tells us near the beginning, might have misinterpreted the relationship and this silent distance as actually kind of comfortable familiarity, not needing to talk to somebody that you're really comfortable with. But as we dig deeper into the characters throughout the passage, we learn that this is very far from the truth. There is nothing comfortable about this silence between them. It's hostile. It speaks of a broken relationship and lost love instead. Critics have speculated, so critic Keith Wilson speculated how far Hardy's interest in and his really forensic examination of a broken marriage here might have stemmed from his own experiences of his parents' forced union. We go back to that little biography of him there. His own parents married under pressure to keep up social appearances and to be perceived as moral. Or even more immediately, when Hardy was writing not far from the Madding Crowd, we've looked at that one, the Mayor of Casterbridge, he was growing increasingly estranged from his own wife as their years of marriage passed. So there certainly could be autobiographical readings that could be offered here. Okay, carrying on then with that opening, Hardy then focuses his attention upon Mrs. Henchard. So we've had a more detailed description of Michael Henchard and his walk, lots of foreshadowing there, and now we move to Mrs. Henchard. The chief, almost the only attraction of the young woman's face was its mobility. When she looked down sideways to the girl, she became pretty and even handsome. Particularly that in the action her features caught slantwise the rays of the strongly coloured sun, which made transparencies of her eyelids and nostrils and set fire on her lips. When she plodded on in the shade of the hedge, silently thinking, she had the hard, half apathetic expression of one who deems anything possible at the hands of time and chance, except perhaps fair play. That the man and woman were husband and wife and the parents of the girl in arms, there could be little doubt. No other than such relationship would have accounted for the atmosphere of stale familiarity which the trio carried along with them like a nimbus as they moved down the road. Okay, so we've moved our focus onto Mrs. Henchard and things haven't really become any more optimistic. It's a brutally frank appraisal, I think, of her feminine beauty. She's only attractive when her face is seen in movement. And the narrator then uses her physical demeanour as a springboard into her worldview, and it's a very interesting one, which I have highlighted for us in blue. So I'm just going to repeat that a little bit because we're going to dig into that a bit deeper. She had the hard, half apathetic expression of one who deems anything possible at the hands of time and chance, except perhaps fair play. So Hardy, very interestingly here at the opening of the novel, is giving us a character who expects to lose. She doesn't expect fair play in life. Tellingly, there is no reference here to God or his divine plan, and the world clearly to Mrs. Henchard is governed more chaotically by the dual indifferent forces of time and chance, which Hardy personifies here. And in a very cynical remark at the end of that sentence, fair play in life seems unlikely to Mrs. Henchard. So the suggestion really is that in the way that she sees the world, it's predominantly a cruel place. So here I think Hardy appears to project his own loss of faith in a comforting divine scheme upon the character of Mrs. Henchard. He was to go on to write several poems on the theme of his loss of faith. And he has, as I say, has been called, but bleak in his outlook by critics. He wrote a poem called "He Never Expected Much," which I think, reaching real notes of depression there about the outlook of life. He never expected much. So like many of his generation, to just build in a bit of context, Hardy was raised in traditions of the church, but later found the simplicity of that childhood faith shattered. As I said earlier, he was 19 when The Origin of Species was published, proposing the theory of biological evolution by natural selection, rather than at the careful workings of an omnipotent, benevolent God. And throughout his lifetime, he was open, sometimes to the point of controversy, about his agnosticism and his difficulties with church doctrine. So perhaps we're seeing some of that loss of faith and this sort of sense of life being random and not particularly being fair and actually being quite cruel, being projected here onto our character, Mrs. Henchard. Once again here, the stale couple, as we learned, there's a stale familiarity about them. Their future losses are foreshadowed. Mrs. Henchard's cynicism, which we see here, this idea that, life isn't going to give her a fair deal, is rewarded very quickly within the novel, as their marriage does indeed quickly reach its breaking point. So this is very much near the beginning of the novel, the event that throws the rest of the narrative on its course. The couple arrive promptly at a local fair where a drunken Henchard, he's not drunk yet in our descriptions, but he does become very drunk, viewing his wife as a burden and an obstacle to his social progression up the hierarchy, decides to sell her cruelly to the highest bidder. So he does auction off his wife, and together with her, his child. And this is the impulsive action which drives the plot of the novel and sets into motion a destructive chain of loss and longing, from which Henchard never really recovers. I'm not going to spoil what happens next. So a great deal does happen next. But I'm going to move instead to a moment near the close of the novel where Henchard, who has at this point undergone lots of misfortunes, returns to the site of the fair where he made that fateful error of auctioning off his wife, which is just after the passages that we have seen. So here we go, a passage from very near the end of the novel, where he returns to that very spot where he sold his wife, and contemplates what has happened to him. So we have the renowned hill whereon the annual fair had been held for so many generations was now bare of human beings, and almost of aught besides. A few sheep grazed thereabout, but these ran off when Henchard halted upon the summit. He deposited his basket upon the turf and looked about with sad curiosity, till he discovered the road by which his wife and himself had entered on the upland so memorable to both 2 or 23 years before. Yes, we came up that way, he said, after ascertaining his bearings. Then we crossed about here. She was so sad and weary, and I speaking to her hardly at all, because of my cursed pride and mortification at being poor. Then we saw the tent. That must have stood more this way. He walked to another spot. It was not really where the tent had stood, but it seemed so to him. Here we went in, and here we sat down. I faced this way, then I drank and committed my crime. It must have been just on that very pixie ring that she was standing when she said her last words to me before going off with him. I can hear their sound now, and the sound of her sobs. He intended to go on from this place, visited as an act of penance, into another part of the country altogether, but he could not help thinking of Elizabeth and the quarter of the horizon in which she lived. Out of this it happened that the centrifugal tendency imparted by weariness of the world was counteracted by the centripetal influence of his love for his stepdaughter. As a consequence, instead of following a straight course yet further away from Casterbridge, Henchard gradually, almost unconsciously, deflected from that right line of his first intention, till by degrees his wandering, like that of the Canadian woodsman, became part of a circle of which Casterbridge formed the centre. So there we go. So a passage from very near the end of the novel. So Hardy takes a moment at the beginning of the passage, and I've highlighted it in blue for us, to mourn the demise of a traditional rural community. As we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, as the 19th century progressed, rural ways of life were starting to change. People were starting to move away from the countryside because of increasing mechanisation and more jobs being available in urban areas. And here we have our character returning to mourn the decisions he made as a younger man and the impact they have had upon him. And we've got this rural setting of the annual fair, now bare of human beings, and not much else there besides. So the barren scenery at this point within the novel serves the dual purpose, I think, of allowing Hardy to mourn the loss of those rural traditions and communities, but also it's a fittingly sombre backdrop for Henchard's contemplation of his mistakes and his subsequent loss. There is irony and humour. There's often lots of irony within Hardy's writing. When Hardy undercuts Henchard's remorseful pilgrimage with an intrusive narrative observation, it was, and again in blue highlighted for you to pick out, it was not really where the tent had stood, but it seemed so to him. So in a lovely moment, our narrator even points out, you know, he's not even in the right place actually, but he thinks this is the patch where it happened. So I think Henchard is really injected with humanity as a result of that wry little observation from the narrator. His memory, like everyone's, is fallible, and it makes us feel the more pity for him. At the end of this passage, we learn that his longing for love and human affection has bound him in a circular journey around the outskirts of Casterbridge. A stark contrast to the earlier character who we saw in those initial passages, who rejected love and family ties due to that desire to raise his status. So he is a man who has very much learned the lessons of his mistakes and is now actually longing for the closeness, the familial relationships that at one time in his life as a younger man, he was so ready to throw away. And remember all of that imagery of the silence, the hostility between himself and his wife. Okay, so Hardy uses a cyclical structure to draw attention to the heartache that Henchard has suffered since he made that reckless, drunken decision to sell his wife. And in the passage that follows, we have an internal journey that he's undergone in the years that have intervened, one which has left him incapable of countering his losses and clawing himself up the social hierarchy once more. So here is the passage that I'm talking about. And thus Henchard found himself again on the precise standing which he had occupied a quarter of a century before. So he does eventually reach the correct part of the landscape. Externally, there was nothing to hinder his making another start on the upward slope, and by his new lights achieving higher things than his soul in its half-formed state had been able to accomplish. But the ingenious machinery contrived by the gods for reducing human possibilities of amelioration to a minimum, which arranges that wisdom to do shall come pari passu with the departure of zest for doing, stood in the way of all that. He had no wish to make an arena a second time of a world that had become a mere painted scene to him. So Henchard here on this journey, he's gone back to the place where he made those initial mistakes, but he has been undone, we learn here, not by a lack of opportunity to better himself, to learn from his mistakes, to raise himself within the social hierarchy again and perhaps form new relationships, but rather he's undone by the departure of zest for doing. He has simply lost the will to rebuild his life. So once again, Hardy references a lack of divine care here. We have a metaphor here blaming multiple gods for their machinery, which leads to kind of ironic consequences, that by the time we gain the wisdom to do better, we've lost the hope and enthusiasm that we need to be able to do better. And this is the condition that Henchard finds himself in. He's older, he's wiser, he's learned lessons, he could shape a better path, but at the same time cruelly, and here kind of the divine system is being accused of the cruelty here of this. He's lost any will and spark to actually go and do that, and so he gives up. I'm going to move from that, a little bit of a depressing end there for the Mayor of Casterbridge, but please do go on and read it if you have the time. We're going to focus in next on love, loss and longing, and touch upon how Hardy explores those key ideas and themes within his poetry. Okay, so we have poem number 1. And just to frame his poetry, so Hardy, although he initially wanted to be a poet, he found his success writing novels and didn't turn again to writing poetry until he was an older man. So the poems that we're seeing today come from an older Hardy. So we've got a number of autobiographical pieces. So the first one here that I've selected for us to think about is To Lisby Brown. It looks really long, but the lines are very short, so I'm just going to give this one a quick reading. And this is a poem about early love. So we have, Dear Lisby Brown, where are you now? In sun, in rain, or is your brow past joy, past pain, dear Lisby Brown? Sweet Lisby Brown, how you could smile, how you could sing, how archly wile in glance giving, sweet Lisby Brown. And Lisby Brown, who else had hair bay red as yours, or flesh so fair bred out of doors, sweet Lisby Brown? When, Lisby Brown, you had just begun to be endeared by stealth to one, you disappeared, my Lisby Brown. Ay, Lisby Brown, so sweet your life, and mine so slow. You were a wife ere I could show love, Lisby Brown. Still, Lisby Brown, you won, they say, the best of men when you were wed. Where went you then, O Lisby Brown? Dear Lisby Brown, I should have thought girls ripen fast and coaxed and caught you ere you passed, dear Lisby Brown. But Lisby Brown, I let you slip, shaped not a sign, touched never your lip with the lip of mine, lost Lisby Brown. So, Lisby Brown, when on a day men speak of me, as not you'll say, and who was he? Yes, Lisby Brown. Okay, so Hardy within this poem is addressing a woman named Elizabeth Bishop. So it is a very autobiographical poem. So Elizabeth Bishop is the subject of the poem. She was the daughter of a local gamekeeper. And according to Michael Milgate's The Life and Work of Thomas Hardy, Elizabeth won Hardy's boyish admiration, but she despised him as being 2 or 3 years her junior. So very much an instance of he had a crush on an older girl, and she, seeing him as just a younger boy in the year below her, rejected his advances. Not that there really were any advances if we delve into the poem, but we're capturing feelings here of an unrequited love. Okay, so interestingly, Hardy, as an older man here, an older poet, is clearly looking back upon his relationship, or we might call it a lack of relationship, with Elizabeth through the eyes of an older man. But the tenderness of his language, despite that passage of time, is very striking. This is a man writing this poem as a successful literary figure, and yet he's hearkening back to an instance of early love when he was at school and he was rejected. Over the course of the poem, and I've picked out all of the instances, or a lot of the instances here, he addresses her with the affectionate dear, sweet, and that nickname Lisby, that affectionate familiar term, which forms the framework of every stanza, opening and closing each one. And it creates a sense of childlike obsession or infatuation. So there's a lingering sense of closeness to this figure of Elizabeth Brown, as he reminisces about her youthful feminine attractions, which he lists emphatically without the poem, despite the fact that so much time has passed and that he is now an older writer. And I think all of that tenderness and that sense of closeness and immediacy about his feelings for her contrast really starkly and movingly with the absolute uncertainty regarding what became of her. So throughout the poem, despite his fervent memories of the impression she made on him, his questions, which recur throughout the poem, make it clear that they lack that closeness suggested by all of this tender, intimate language towards her, much to Hardy's great regret. So we have, where are you now? Is your brow past joy, past pain? So Hardy here even questioning, are you even alive still? Are you past joy and pain? A bit of an idealised reference to death there as being a state of being beyond joy or pain. By stanza 4, his tone becomes almost accusing as he reflects, you disappeared, my Lisby Brown. Note the hyperbolic verb disappeared there and his use of that possessive pronoun, capturing his profound sense of loss as he reflects that Elizabeth married somebody else. And there are moving notes of regret to follow as he honestly reflects, I, Lisby Brown, so swift your life and mine so slow. And I think his use of antithesis captures there his envy of the older, more mature young woman who seems so full of life and confidence, while the assonance so slow, drawing out the line, indicates his own sense of how he was undeveloped and stagnant when compared to her. And there's a real sense of sadness, I think, as he declares with that raw honesty that I spoke about at the beginning of the lecture. You were a wife, he says, ere I could show love. So you were married before I could show love, Lisby Brown. So he was too young, too inexperienced, and time marched on almost without him. And I wonder whether it's acceptance within, so the stanza here, still Lisby Brown, you won, they said, the best of men when you were wed. Is there acceptance within that ellipsis that she married a good man? Okay, so an acceptance of she went on to have a successful relationship, fair enough. Or actually, does that ellipsis mark a lack of conviction? I think it's quite ambiguous. Is there a sense of bitterness here? Did she really marry the better man? Or does that suggest some uncertainty about that? Does he always feel perhaps that he would have made a good husband for her if she hadn't grown up so quickly? So this sense of longing for things to have been different really reaches its climax as he recognises his own role in allowing this opportunity of early life to slip away from him. So he says, moving towards the end of the poem, I should have thought girls ripen fast and coaxed and caught you ere you passed, dear Lisby Brown. So these lines, full of energy and action, heightened by the use of alliteration, contrast really movingly, I think, with the reality of his passive behaviour as he carries on. But Lisby Brown, so next stanza, I let you slip, shaped not a sign, touched never your lip with lip of mine. So the syntax of these lines, shaped not, touched never, capture the power of his regret, I think, throwing our focus before the negatives upon what might have been, the tender actions which could have replaced his hesitation if only he'd been bolder. So contrasting this poignant sense of longing for what never was, there is some of that characteristic irony, realism, and a bit of self-deprecating humour from Hardy in that conversational closing stanza, as he contemplates the likelihood that Elizabeth, who clearly was so dear to him, would have no memory of him at all. So here we go, right at the end of the poem. As not you'll say, and who was he? So if you were asked about me today, as likely or not, you'd say, and who's he then? So it's a lulling poem with a repetitive, almost childlike structure, as you can see. But I think its message is really one of adult wisdom, reinforcing that idea that time moves more quickly than you might think. So seize the day to avoid the regret of unfulfilled love or lost opportunities is very much the message beneath kind of this on the surface, quite a childlike poem. Okay, we're going to move quickly on to another poem in which Hardy speaks about loss. So it's similarly sombre and affectionate, and this time, and also autobiographical. This time, the subject of his poem is his cousin. You can see an image of her on the screen, Tryphena Sparks, who was also thought to have been an early love of Hardy's. Some people have even speculated that she was his fiancée for a time. Don't ask me why. I know they were cousins. It sounds a bit strange to us, but these were different times. So there we go, you know, a potential romantic relationship between Hardy and his cousin. And he wrote this, as you can see, at the news of her death. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly read out what's on the screen. Not a line of her writing have I, nor not a thread of her hair. No mark of her late time as dame in her dwelling, whereby I may picture her there. And in vain do I urge my insight to conceive my lost prize. At her close, whom I knew when her dreams were upbrimming with light, and with laughter her eyes. What scenes spread around her last days, sad, shining, or dim? Did her gifts and compassions enray and enarch her sweet ways with an aureate nim? Or did life light decline from her years, and mischances control her full day star? Unease or regret or forebodings or fears disenable her soul. Thus I do but the phantom retain of the maiden of yore as my relic, yet haply the best of her find in my brain. It may be the more that no line of her writing have I, nor a thread of her hair, no mark of her late time as dame in her dwelling, whereby I may picture her there. So thoughts of Fina there, and we're not going to linger long on this one. So Hardy once again seems unsettled within this poem by his own uncertainty surrounding the life of a loved one, questioning once again how she spent her later days, this time with much more elaborate use of vocabulary and imagery. You can see that very much in that second stanza there, fitting very much for the mood of an elegy. We've got an opening trio of negatives and not a line, not a thread, no mark of her, which set a tone of grief and create the sense of a struggle for closure. And within this period, there was what was termed the Victorian cult of mourning. It would be the norm to keep as keepsakes some of the hair of a loved one who had died. You can see there, I found it a little bit creepy really, but the Victorians were very sentimental, and there was this cult surrounding death where you would keep mementos of the dead loved one. Hardy is left with none of that. He doesn't have any possessions to mark his relationship and feelings for his cousin who has now died. However, despite that, he ends the poem with a more comforting turn of argument to counter his sense of distance and that uncertainty and loss. So using some of his characteristic archaic language, we see quite a lot of that within his poetry and his novels. In the final stanza, Hardy speaks of the phantom of the maiden of yore as all that he has left of his cousin Tryphena. Yet this metaphoric phantom, his memory of his cousin in her vivacious days as a younger woman, he reasons is worth much more than a concrete line of her writing or a thread of her hair, like the one on the screen. So using a cyclical poetic structure, he champions instead the power and value of his memories over that of any physical relics of his cousin. Using this thought that he still has his memories of her to temper that sense of grief at the severance and loss caused by death. And Hardy was to turn to memories again as a source of great comfort, or debatably, some might say his memories tormented him in his poems of 1912 to 1913, which we're going to move to next. And I'm aware we're running past 6, so I promise we are getting very much towards the end. Okay, so poems of 1912 to 1913. So Norman Page said of Hardy in his poetry, love is most often a matter either of vanished joys or of missed opportunities. And we've seen evidence of both so far. However, to Norman Page, Hardy's finest outpouring in his early 70s was the sequence to which he gave the unrevealing title Poems of 1912 to 13. So the poems that Page refers to followed the death of Hardy's first wife, Emma, in November 1912. And I've put images of her on the screen. Firstly, the younger Emma, who Hardy married, and then the older woman that she became. So Hardy was once deeply in love with his wife, as we'd expect, and he spoke of the magic that he felt when he met her in Cornwall on that work commission as an architect. But unfortunately, the relationship soured over time. And in the last 20 years of their marriage, they became very much estranged from each other. And you can see here images of the screen. So if you do have the chance to visit Max Gate, Thomas Hardy's marital home, you can see downstairs the sort of rooms that Hardy would have occupied, and then upstairs, his wife Emma, as their marriage became more and more strained, she essentially lived a separate life in the attic rooms of the building, and you can see those to the right. So kind of a very, very narrow room, and he spent much time downstairs with his young secretary Florence, who he later went on to marry. So presumably there were flirtations going on between Hardy and his young secretary, and Emma was living a separate life upstairs, so very bleak. However, at Emma's death, Hardy's feelings towards his wife changed dramatically. He was overcome with a sense of loss, grief, and regret for his behaviour towards her in her later years. And the fire of his grief was fuelled by his discovery of her diaries, which she entitled What I Think of My Husband, and set out her thoughts very bluntly within her diaries about his cruelty and neglect of her. So Hardy, having lost his wife, then discovered what exactly she thought about him and how he treated her. And in what Page calls a curious act of atonement and self-punishment, Hardy decided to revisit the places that they had gone together in Cornwall when they were first courting. And this process of revisiting, which I find strangely familiar to what we saw in the Mayor of Casterbridge, Henchard returning to the point where he had left and abandoned his wife. Hardy here revisiting haunts of himself and his wife in better days. So this process of revisiting inspired a number of his best known poems, and we're just going to have a look at one of those. So last full poem, everybody, before the end of the lecture. So The Going is a really fantastic example of Hardy's reaction to his wife's death. So he says, why did you give no hint that night that quickly after the morrow's dawn, and calmly as if indifferent quite, you would close your term here, up and be gone, where I could not follow with wing of swallow to gain one glimpse of you ever and on, never to bid goodbye or lip me the softest call, or utter a wish for a word while I saw morning harden upon the wall, unmoved, unknowing that your great going had placed that moment and altered all. Why do you make me leave the house and think for a breath it is you I see at the end of the alley of bending boughs, where so often at dusk you used to be, till in darkening dankness the yawning blankness of the perspective sickens me. You were she who abode by those red-veined rocks far west. You were the swan-necked one who rode along the beetling beany crest, and reigning nigh me would muse and eye me, while life unrolled us its very best. Why then latterly did we not speak, did we not think of those days long dead, and ere your vanishing strive to seek that time's renewal? We might have said, in this bright spring weather, we'll visit together those places that once we visited. Well, well, all's past amend, unchangeable, it must go. I seem but a dead man held on end to sink down soon. Oh, you could not know that such swift fleeing, no soul foreseeing, not even I, would undo me so. Philip Larkin remarked that not until Hardy's first wife had died could his love poetry for her be written, and then it was mixed with a flood of regret and remorse for what he had lost. And I think we very much see that within this poem, The Going. So we've got the euphemistic title, The Going, which itself draws attention to the great significance of Hardy's loss. And Hardy within this poem lays his shock and sorrow at the finality of their parting bare, explaining to Emma that he was unmoved, unknowing as she slipped away from him. And yet the magnitude of the moment was so profound. And here Hardy lingers on one of life's painful ironies, as he so often did within his writing, that significant events and specifically losses so often occur when we're completely oblivious to them. Hardy confesses within the poem to being utterly haunted by Emma's death, imagining her familiar presence around him as he struggles to come to terms with her absence, a cruel trick of the brain suffered by many as they experience grief. He says, "Why do you make me leave the house and think for a breath it is you I see?" His pain on realising that she is no longer there is palpable, as he speaks of his reality as a meaningless void of darkening dankness and yawning blankness, using assonance and bleak imagery to emphasise his sense of the emptiness of his life without her. Hardy then reminisces with romantic imagery upon his first meetings with a spirited Emma amongst the wild and rugged backdrop of the Cornish coast, something which he does within many of the poems within this sequence. So he very much remembers, if we go back to that image, the young Emma, the vibrant Emma, of the first days of his courtship. The sense of energy and beauty conjured by his references to the red-veined rocks and swan-necked Emma on horseback, a far cry, of course, from the aged couple's bitter domestic existence together in their more recent years. Page states that repeatedly in reading a Hardy poem, we have a sense of intrusion, of gaining access almost illicitly and properly to secret feelings. And I think this is certainly the case with many of the questions within this poem, beginning with why. And in particular with Hardy's query in the stanza reliving their courtship, why then latterly did we not speak? Did we not think of those days long dead and strive to seek that time's renewal? So in a moment of great intimacy, he speaks of his regret and remorse for the hostility and the silence that plagued the later years of their marriage. His revisitation here, both physical and mental, of the landscape of their early love, only serves to sharpen the sense of longing and sorrow surrounding the loss. But the collective pronouns within the poem, this idea of why did we not return, why did we not relive this together, come too late, as he's ultimately forced to acknowledge towards the end of the poem. Well, all's past amend, unchangeable, it must go. So short sentences are used here to banish his thoughts of what might have been and his construction of an alternative future for them as a couple. Hardy's tone becomes surprisingly pragmatic for a moment. Well, it's all done now, can't be changed, before collapsing yet again at the end of the poem into a simple expression of his grief and shock. Oh, you could not know that such swift fleeing, no soul foreseeing, not even I, would undo me so. The loss expressed here is really acute, as he admits, I think, ever so honestly, to being utterly overwhelmed. There's nothing of consolation to close the poem, but instead a lingering, deeply honest sense of his struggle. And just to brighten the mood a little bit at the very end of the lecture, I don't want to leave you there with Hardy struggling and overwhelmed by grief. All hope was not lost for Hardy. So despite being an agnostic and suffering, as we can see, some intense grief at the loss of his wife, he does often within his writing reflect upon the comforts of humanity living on, as we saw in Thoughts of Thena. He was comforted by the idea of memories living on. He still possessed memories of a vivid Tryphena. He possesses his memories of his early happy courtship with Emma. So we have memories to comfort us. But Hardy also found a lot of solace in the natural landscape, and in a number of his poems and in his novels, he celebrates the beauty of nature and nature as a form of redemption, something to turn to when all else perhaps has been lost. And his poems are even read today at humanist funerals in recognition of the fact that he was perhaps an early humanist in some of his views. So this is the case for Emma in I Found Her Out There, and we're just going to look at the very last stanza. So responding to the death of Emma yet again, he says, yet her shade maybe will creep underground till it catch the sound of that western sea as it swells and sobs where she once domiciled, and joy in its throbs with the heart of a child. So beautifully, he imagines Emma's soul somehow finding its way again into the scenery surrounding the ocean, where she lived as a younger woman in Cornwall, and finding joy within the throbbing of the sea, and once again having the heart of a child. And it's an idea that Hardy picked up on a lot. He wrote a few beautiful poems about the churchyard in Stinsford, and imagining the various people buried there as somehow growing into trees and living again as part of nature. So it really was a force for good for him, and a way of finding comfort in an otherwise perhaps bleak world to Hardy. So I hope everyone that this lecture has given you a sense of the emotional intricacy and timelessness of Hardy's writing, and his eagerness as a writer to keep alive a bygone age. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, and apologies for running over slightly. There we go.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Eagleton. That was absolutely amazing. And I certainly learned quite a lot about Thomas Hardy just from this past hour and a quarter. Now, in the Q&A, you are most welcome to ask any questions. I can't see any questions at the moment, so I thought perhaps I should start the ball rolling. I don't know if anybody else would like to ask a question, but obviously we won't keep you too long because time is moving on. But one of the questions I had was, does Thomas Hardy actually write anything that's happy?
I mean, a lot of it is, I think a lot of it is bleak, but there are definitely some more joyful poems about childhood memories. And like I said, there's a really beautiful one called Transformations, where he talks about walking around the churchyard, and it's the churchyard that he's buried in now, which I think is quite a nice thought. And he imagines all of the people of previous generations. He remembers them from being at church, and he talks about how they're finding life now in a tree or budding out of a rose. So I think, I think he was very honest about the cruelties of life, and about sort of how we saw life as cruelly ironic. But there are definitely, I mean, I wouldn't read a Hardy novel to cheer myself up, let's put it that way. I haven't read all of them, but I've read a good few, and they are all pretty depressing. But definitely within his poetry, there are certainly some more uplifting poems to be found there. So yeah, if you want a happier Hardy, maybe look at some of his poetry instead.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody else got any questions? I do actually have a couple more, but I wouldn't want to keep us if people haven't got any more questions. Does anybody else have a question? If you do, please put it in the Q&A. And Dr. Eagleton will deal with it, hopefully. I can't see anything coming up at the moment. I'll just finish this then very quickly. Just one final comment, I suppose, really, is do you think that Thomas Hardy felt constrained to write like this and was potentially creating a genre for himself?
I think so. I think he very much saw that, well, obviously he had his initial failure, and then he was successful publishing his novels in kind of a serial magazine form. And I think he did suffer from perhaps society expecting certain things, and definitely, almost I suppose like our famous writers today, I think people did expect certain things from him within his novels, and he was probably very aware that the successful sale of them depended on him delivering that kind of narrative. There are a lot of similarities. There's some very dramatic kind of twists and turns and romantic things within plots where it does at times feel. I was reading The Mayor of Casterbridge on holiday in the summer, and I did feel at times like this is just like a Victorian EastEnders at times, with some of these ridiculous kind of turns within the plot. And I think probably that was an element of trying to please his audiences, and that the weight of kind of giving people what they wanted once he did find success. So I think there is an element of that. I feel within his poetry, he wrote that at a point in his life where he could perhaps afford to be a little bit more honest and indulge his own tastes and feelings. And I think specifically kind of that the writing about his wife, I don't think that feels at all contrived or like he was responding to social pressure. There's also, I mean, as well, with elements of his writing, like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, it was censored. So he was quite outspoken about, and anyone who's interested in Victorian issues surrounding women and the sexual double standard, he was really criticised for defending the character of Tess within Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And there were some alterations to the chapter that deals with her rape and makes it more ambiguous whether she's raped or not, because it became kind of a matter that he was criticised about morally. So yeah, there were definitely, I think, social pressures on him. But I'd say perhaps his poetry was a little bit freer from those pressures.
Okay, there is a question here, and you've just answered it in lots of ways, actually. It's from, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, Maya Shigdar. And the question is, in Tess, would you argue that he has a feminist outlook?
Yeah, I think that he definitely does. I think he's disgusted really by the kind of imposition of like supposed, well, I think he saw morality as quite destructive within the Victorian period and prudishness. And I think he does really defend Tess in a way that would be considered feminist today. He doesn't see why she should be the victim of such hypocritical patriarchal standards. And I think we see criticism of the church within that. So not only feminism, but I think criticism of the hypocrisy of kind of the church and how it could be very self-righteous in its treatment of people, but particularly of women. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I do think he was an early feminist. It's just a shame. I always throw this out. It's just so sad then when you realise how he treated his own wife. But there we go. Dickens was similar.
There is another question here, which I'll read from Dr. Hart. How can we reconcile this feminist stance given his own dreadful treatment of his wife? And you've just referred to that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think he clearly had certain ideals that he perhaps, like many people, couldn't live up to in his own life. Yeah, but it's I think he perhaps at least later on did recognise that his treatment of her had been really poor, even if it took coming across her diaries accusing him of various things once she died to realise it. But I think, like many people, he had ideals that he wasn't able to uphold in his own kind of in his own relationships, which is a shame. So it's difficult to reconcile it.
Okay, we are looking at almost 6:25 now. I should imagine that quite a lot of people would love to say thank you to you, Dr. Eagleton. It was a most illuminating lecture. And I think all of us will have learned quite a lot about Thomas Hardy, and we'll be going out to buy as much as we can to read over the next few months. So thank you very much indeed. And yes, somebody is actually demonstrating their appreciation. So perhaps we can demonstrate our appreciation via the emojis and the hands, please. Thank you very much.
everyone.
That was absolutely excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hart.
Thank
Sorry,
you very
I was going to say
much.
Dr. Hart for his question, Maya for her question, and thank you all for attending, and thank you, Dr. Eagleton, for a really amazing lecture.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.